I had always been the kind of person who liked being alone. It wasn't that I hated people. I just felt better when I was out in the quiet, away from all the noise and expectations of daily life. That's why I had gotten into solo camping. It gave me a sense of control, a break from the world, and, most importantly, a feeling of peace. I had done plenty of solo trips before, sometimes for just a night, sometimes for a few days at a time. I had always been careful, always prepared. I had the right gear, the right knowledge, and the right mindset. I wasn't careless. I didn't take dumb risks. But all of that didn't matter, because none of it prepared me for what happened out there in the woods. It was late September when I set out on what I thought would be a simple 3-day camping trip. I had picked a remote section of a national forest, the kind of place where the trails were more like suggestions than actual paths. It was deep wilderness, far from any roads or campsites. I wanted solitude, and this place offered it in abundance. I parked my truck at a small dirt pull-off, loaded my pack onto my shoulders, and started hiking. The air was cool, crisp with the first hints of autumn. The leaves were just beginning to change, splashes of red and orange breaking through the endless green. The trail I followed was barely visible, just a faint indentation in the underbrush that I had to keep my eyes on to avoid losing it completely. After about 4 hours of hiking, I found a good spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing near a stream, the kind of place that felt untouched. No signs of other campers, no trash, no fire rings. Just nature in its rawest form. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and got everything in order before the sun dipped below the tree line. As night fell, I ate a simple meal, sat by the fire, and let the stillness of the forest settle over me. It should have been peaceful, but something felt off. I couldn't explain it. There was nothing obvious. No strange sounds, no movement in the trees, nothing that should have made me uneasy. But I felt it, a sense of something just beyond my understanding, like the woods were watching me. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I had been out in the wilderness alone plenty of times, and I knew how easy it was for my thoughts to drift into paranoia. The human brain isn't built for isolation, and sometimes when you spend too much time alone, you start to feel things that aren't there. So I ignored it. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and forced myself to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding. I didn't know why. There was no noise, no movement. Nothing obvious that had startled me awake. But I was alert, my senses on edge. I listened. The forest was silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of animals. Just nothing. An unnatural silence. I sat up slowly, my breath shallow. I felt exposed, like I was being watched, like something was just outside the thin fabric of my tent. But when I unzipped the flap and peered out, there was nothing but darkness. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow on the surrounding trees. Everything looked normal, and yet the feeling wouldn't go away. I scanned the trees, my eyes struggling to adjust, my ears strained for any sound, any movement, but there was nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my nerves. I had woken up for no reason, and my brain had latched onto fear because that's what brains do in the dark. I lay back down, forced myself to breathe slowly, forced my eyes shut. Eventually, sleep came. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy. That strange silence from the night before still lingered in my mind. But when I stepped out of my tent, the forest seemed normal again. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, the stream gurgled nearby. The feeling of being watched had faded, replaced by the ordinary calm of the woods. I told myself I had let my imagination get the better of me. I had a full day of hiking and exploring ahead of me, and I wasn't going to let one weird night ruin the trip. After a quick breakfast, I packed a small day bag and set off. I didn't stray too far from camp. I wasn't reckless, but I wanted to see more of the area. The forest was dense, the terrain rugged. I moved slowly, taking in the sights, enjoying the crisp air. But as the day went on, that uneasy feeling started creeping back in. I started noticing things, little things, subtle things, like how the birds would go quiet every now and then, like something unseen was moving through the trees, like how I would occasionally catch a whiff of something strange, something that didn't belong in the woods, a faint, sour, almost metallic scent that made my stomach twist, like how the trees seemed wrong. Not all of them, just certain ones. Some had deep gouges in the bark, too high up to be from animals. Others had branches twisted in unnatural ways, almost like something had grabbed them and wrenched them sideways. I told myself I was overthinking, that I was letting my nerves get the better of me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I turned back toward camp. When I got there, I stopped cold. Something had been in my camp. My gear was untouched, nothing stolen, nothing knocked over. But the ground was wrong. There were prints, not boot prints, not paw prints, just deep, sunken impressions, like something heavy had stood there. I stared at them, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. They weren't shaped like feet. They weren't shaped like anything I could recognize. And there was that smell again, stronger now, pungent, rotting. My instincts screamed at me to leave. I packed up as fast as I could, my hands shaking. I didn't care about the rest of the trip. I didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of those woods. I started hiking back the way I had come, my pace quick, my head on a swivel. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig made my heart pound. I could feel it. Something was out there, and it was following me. I walked for hours, never stopping, never resting. I didn't care about exhaustion. I just wanted to get back to my truck. But as the sun dipped lower, I realized something horrifying. I was lost. I had followed the same trail I had taken in, I was sure of it. But now nothing looked familiar. The landmarks I had marked in my head weren't there. It was like the forest had shifted around me. Panic started creeping in. I took out my map and compass, trying to reorient myself. And then I heard it. A low, guttural sound. Not a growl. Not a howl. Something deeper. Wrong. I ran. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the forest floor, gasping for air. And when I looked up, I saw them. More of those prints. Circling me. I never made it back to my truck. The forest swallowed me whole. I've always liked being alone in the wilderness. There's something about the stillness of it, the way the air feels cleaner, the way time seems to slow down when you're deep in the woods with nothing but your own thoughts. It was never about proving anything to anyone. I just enjoyed the quiet, the solitude. That's why, when I decided to take a solo hunting trip deep into the backcountry of Montana, I didn't hesitate. I had done it before. I had experience. I knew what I was doing, or at least I thought I did. The plan was simple. A 7-day trip deep into an area I had scouted on a map. A remote stretch of national forest, miles away from any roads or towns. No trails, no campsites, no signs of human activity. Just wilderness. I had my rifle, a .308 bolt action that I trusted. My pack was heavy with supplies, food, water, first aid, extra layers, a satellite GPS, and everything else I might need. I had checked the weather, made sure I had all the right gear. I parked my truck at the edge of a dirt road, shouldered my pack, and started walking. The first few hours were familiar, hard hiking through thick forest, following a ridgeline that would eventually drop me into a valley where I planned to set up camp. The weather was perfect, cool and crisp, the scent of pine thick in the air. Everything felt right. By late afternoon, I had covered about 10 miles and found a good spot to make camp, a small clearing near a slow-moving creek. The ground was flat, dry, and there was plenty of firewood around. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and cooked a quick meal. As the sun set, I leaned back against my pack and listened to the forest. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the brush, the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the darkness. All normal sounds, all familiar. But as the night stretched on, I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it. The forest was quiet, but not unnaturally so. There were no strange noises, no movement in the trees that I couldn't explain. And yet, something felt wrong. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. Spending time alone in the wilderness can do that. The human brain isn't built for complete isolation, and when you're alone, your mind fills in the gaps. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and tried to sleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't know why. There was no sound, no movement outside my tent, but my heart was pounding. My body was tense, like I had been pulled from sleep by something unseen. I lay there listening. The forest was silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. I reached for my rifle, my fingers wrapping around the stock. I wasn't scared. At least that's what I told myself. But something was off. I waited, listening, barely breathing. Nothing. After a while, I forced myself to relax. I had probably just woken up for no reason. My mind on edge from being alone in an unfamiliar place. It happens sometimes. I set the rifle beside me, rolled over, and went back to sleep. Morning came with a thick fog hanging over the valley. The air was damp and cold, and my breath came out in clouds as I stepped out of my tent. I walked down to the creek, splashed cold water on my face, and started making breakfast. The uneasy feeling from the night before was still there, lingering at the edge of my thoughts, but I ignored it. I had a full day of hunting ahead of me. I packed up some gear, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and headed into the woods. The terrain was rough, steep ridges, dense undergrowth, loose rocks underfoot. I moved slowly, carefully, stopping every so often to listen and scan the area. Hours passed. I saw signs of elk, tracks in the damp earth, fresh droppings, a few broken branches where they had moved through, but no actual elk. That wasn't unusual. Hunting required patience. I kept moving, but as the day wore on, that feeling of unease started to creep back in. Something wasn't right. I started noticing things, subtle at first, easy to dismiss. The way the birds would go silent all at once, like something had disturbed them. The way the trees seemed too still, too quiet. The way I would catch the faintest scent of something rotten on the breeze, gone before I could place it. And then I found the carcass. It was an elk, or what was left of one. The body had been torn apart, the ribcage cracked open, the meat stripped away in large, uneven chunks. The head was missing. I crouched down, examining it. The kill was fresh, no more than a day old. But something was off. I had seen plenty of predator kills before. This wasn't one. A bear would have left claw marks. Wolves would have eaten more, scattered the bones. But this looked like it had been butchered, like something had torn into it with hands instead of teeth. I felt my skin crawl. Something had killed this elk. And it wasn't an animal. I stood up slowly, my senses on high alert. The forest was silent again. I wasn't alone. I turned back toward camp, moving quickly but cautiously. I kept my rifle in my hands, my eyes scanning the trees, my ears straining for any sound. Every so often, I would catch that smell again. Faint, rotten, wrong. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I wasn't being paranoid. I knew what paranoia felt like. This was different. The sun was starting to set by the time I reached camp. The fog had thickened, clinging to the trees in heavy, swirling patches. The air felt heavy, charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. And then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They weren't animal tracks. They were deep, wide, uneven, human-shaped, but wrong. like someone had been dragging their feet, like they had been circling my camp again and again. My stomach tightened. I wasn't staying. I grabbed my pack, shoved everything inside, and slung it over my shoulders. I didn't care about the fire. I didn't care about leaving things behind. I just needed to get out. I started hiking, my pace fast but steady, my rifle grip tight. I knew I had about 3 hours of light left, maybe less in the fog. If I pushed hard, I could make it back to my truck before dark. But the feeling didn't go away. It got worse. The sounds of the forest were gone. The air was thick with that horrible, rotting smell. And then, ahead of me on the trail, I saw them. More footprints, fresh, leading toward me. I turned and ran. I ran like my life depended on it. Because it did. The forest blurred around me, branches whipping at my arms, my boots slipping on loose rocks. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop. And then I saw the road, my truck. I sprinted the last stretch, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. Something moved in the trees. A shape, a shadow, too tall, too thin. I didn't wait to see more. I started the engine, slammed the truck into gear, and tore out of there. I didn't stop driving. I didn't look back, and I never went into those woods again. I always liked the woods, not just for hunting or hiking, but for the quiet, the feeling of being away from everything, surrounded by nothing but trees and earth, where the only sounds were the ones that had been there long before me. The deep woods had a way of making everything else feel small: bills, stress, people. It all disappeared when I was out there. That's why I didn't hesitate when my brother-in-law, Jason, invited me on a week-long hunting trip in northern Minnesota. He had a spot way off the beaten path, miles from any road, where he swore he had seen some of the biggest deer tracks of his life. He was an experienced hunter, someone who knew the land, and I trusted his instincts. I packed up everything I needed: my rifle, extra layers, enough food to last, a good first aid kit, my GPS, my knife. I wasn't reckless. I had been out on trips like this before, and I knew how fast things could go bad if you weren't prepared. But no matter how much you prepare, sometimes it doesn't matter, because the woods don't care. The drive took almost a full day. By the time we turned off the paved roads and onto dirt trails, the sun was already low. Jason drove the last stretch, following an old logging road that barely looked used. It was rough, deep with ruts, the kind of path that could wreck a truck if you weren't careful. We parked where the road ended, shouldered our packs, and started hiking. It was supposed to be about 5 miles in, following a narrow game trail through thick brush and uneven ground. The deeper we went, the more I felt it. The quiet. Not the normal kind of forest quiet, where you still hear birds and the occasional rustling in the brush, but a heavier kind. A silence that sat between the trees like a thick fog. By the time we reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp, the last light was fading. We moved fast, getting the tents up, starting a fire, setting up what we could before it was too dark to see. The night was cold. The fire helped, but the air had a dampness to it that settled into my clothes, making me feel colder than I should have. I didn't say anything, but Jason must have felt it too, because he kept throwing more wood onto the fire than we really needed. I didn't sleep well, not because of noises or anything obvious, just that feeling, that strange, heavy quiet. I told myself it was just being in a new place. I should have left the next morning. We spent the first day scouting. Jason led the way, following tracks he swore were fresh. I kept my rifle ready, scanning the trees, listening. But the further we went, the more I started noticing little things that didn't sit right. Broken branches, but too high up for deer. Deep gouges in tree trunks, but not the kind bears leave. And the smell. Every so often, we'd catch a whiff of something rotten, something that made my stomach twist. But there were no carcasses, no sign of a fresh kill. Just that smell. By late afternoon, we hadn't seen a single animal. No dir, nos quirréus, no bardes. Nothing. Just the trees stretching on forever. Jason was frustrated, but I was starting to feel something else. I wasn't sure what, but something about that place felt wrong. That night, the quiet got worse. It wasn't just that there were no animals making noise. It was everything. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant creaks of shifting trees. Just silence. I barely slept. Every time I started to drift off, I'd wake up suddenly, my heart pounding like I had heard something, but there was never anything there. At some point, I must have finally passed out, because the next thing I knew, Jason was shaking me awake. His face was pale. Something had been in our camp. He pointed at the ground near the dying fire. Footprints, not boot prints, bare feet, and they were big, too big to be a normal person's. I stared at them, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. They were deep, pressed hard into the dirt like whoever or whatever had been standing there was heavy. Jason was rattled. So was I. We should have packed up and left right then. But we didn't, because we were miles from the truck. Because we had no idea who or what was out there. Because leaving meant walking back through those woods in the dark. So we stayed. We sat by the fire, rifles across our laps, eyes on the tree line. We didn't sleep. I don't know what time it was when I saw it. A shape, a shadow just at the edge of the trees. Too tall, too thin, and it was watching us. I gripped my rifle so hard my fingers ached. My mind was screaming at me to move, to run, to do something, but I just sat there, frozen. And then it stepped back into the trees. Gone. Jason saw it too. He didn't say a word, just started packing. We left at first light. The hike back to the truck was the longest 5 miles of my life. We didn't talk, didn't stop, just kept moving, rifles ready, every rustling leaf making my heart pound harder. I felt it the whole way, that thing, following, watching, waiting. The second we saw the truck, Jason ran. I wasn't far behind. We threw our gear in, jumped in, and peeled out of there so fast I thought we'd rip the axles off. Neither of us looked back. I don't know what we saw. I don't want to know. Jason won't talk about it. He won't even go into the woods anymore. Sold all his hunting gear. Moved to a different state. Me? I haven't been back either. I still think about it, though. About those footprints. About the way the woods felt. About how, even now, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night with that same feeling. Like something is standing just outside my window, watching. I've been in the woods my whole life. Grew up hunting, fishing, hiking. Spending more time out there than in the town where I was born. I've always felt at home in the wild. The way everything slows down when you're deep enough into the trees that you stop hearing traffic, stop seeing signs of people. Just the woods, the wind, the feeling of being part of something old. I've never been scared out there. Not really. Not the way people who don't belong in the woods get scared. But there was one trip years ago that changed that. One trip that made me understand how fast everything can go wrong. I had planned the hunt for months. A full week. Deep into the Appalachian wilderness. Miles from any road. Any town. Anything. I had picked a spot far off the trails. A place I had only seen on maps. Where I knew the hunting would be good. It wasn't about the challenge. It wasn't about testing myself. It was about getting away, about losing myself in the quiet. I packed carefully, enough food to last, but not too much. I planned on eating what I hunted. A tent, a rifle, my knife, a first aid kit, extra ammo, fire starting gear, and my GPS. I wasn't reckless. I knew what I was doing. I checked the weather before I left. Cool days, cold nights, no storms in the forecast. Everything was set. I loaded up my truck, drove for hours, and turned down an old forest road until it ended. I parked, locked up, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started hiking. It was slow going. No trails, just rough, uneven ground, thick undergrowth, steep inclines. The kind of land that didn't want to be traveled. I loved it. I hiked for most of the day, stopping only when I found a good clearing to set up camp. A small patch of flat ground near a stream, with enough tree cover to block the wind but open enough that I could see anything coming. I built a fire, ate a quick meal, and sat in the fading light, listening to the sounds of the forest. The rustling of small animals, the distant hoot of an owl, the steady trickle of the stream. Normal sounds.
Familiar sounds.
But as the night went on, the feeling started creeping in. Something felt off. I didn't know what. The air was still. The fire crackled. Everything looked the way it should. But the woods felt different, like I wasn't alone. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was just getting in my own head, that I had spent too much time in town, gotten too used to the noise, to the people, to the distractions. I let the fire burn low, crawled into my tent, and fell asleep. I woke up suddenly. No sound, no movement, just the feeling of being yanked out of sleep like someone had shaken me awake. I lay still, listening. The woods were silent. Not normal silent, deep silent. No wind, no insects, no night sounds. Just a heavy, pressing quiet. My heart pounded. I reached for my rifle, my fingers wrapping around the stock. Something was wrong. I listened, waited. Nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour before I finally forced myself to breathe, to let my muscles relax. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. It had to be. I closed my eyes and went back to sleep. Morning came with thick fog hanging in the trees. The air was damp, cold, making my breath cloud in front of me. I climbed out of my tent, stretched, shook off the uneasy feeling from the night before. I built up the fire, made coffee, ate. I told myself the weird feeling was nothing. Then I found the tracks. They were faint, pressed into the damp earth near the edge of my camp. Not animal tracks, not boot prints, bare feet, big, deep. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me while I slept. My stomach clenched. I scanned the woods, searching for movement, for any sign of who or what had been there. Nothing. The fog made everything worse, twisting through the trees, shifting in the wind like something alive. I checked my gear. Everything was there. Whoever it was, they hadn't taken anything. Just stood there, watching. I gripped my rifle tighter. I had been in the woods alone before. I had seen other hunters, hikers, the occasional lost camper. But this was different. I had a choice. Pack up and leave or stick to my plan. I should have left, but I didn't. I spent the day hunting, moving deeper into the woods, rifle ready, eyes scanning the trees. The feeling never went away. I kept seeing things. Broken branches too high for deer, deep gouges in tree trunks, patches of flattened grass where something had stood. And the smell, faint at first, but getting stronger as the day went on. Rotten.
Vet.
Sour. Like something long dead. But there were no carcasses. No sign of a fresh kill. Just that smell, clinging to the air, seeping into my clothes. By late afternoon, I had seen nothing. No deer, no small game, nothing. The woods felt empty. No birds, no movement. Just the shifting fog and the growing sense that I was being watched. I turned back toward camp, moving fast, rifle in hand, every sound making my nerves tighten. By the time I reached my tent, the sun was setting, the fog thickening. The smell was everywhere. I stopped short. My camp was destroyed, my tent shredded, my gear scattered, torn open, the fire pit, kicked apart, embers still glowing in the dirt, and the tracks, circling the camp, big,
Bare.
deep. I wasn't alone. I grabbed what I could, shoving ammo and supplies into my pack, my hands shaking. The fog was too thick to see far. Every shadow looked like something moving. I started walking.
Fast.
The woods pressed in around me, the trees too tall, too close. The smell got worse. I heard something behind me. A crack. A rustle. Heavy footsteps. I didn't stop. Didn't look. Just kept moving. Faster. The footsteps got louder. Something was following me. I ran. Branches tore at my arms. My pack thudding against my back. My lungs burned. My legs screamed. But I didn't stop. I could hear it behind me, moving fast, closing the distance. The truck. I saw it through the trees, the metal gleaming in the dying light. I ran harder, heart pounding, breath ragged. 50 feet, 40, 30. I reached the truck, ripped the door open, threw myself inside. Something moved at the edge of the trees. Tall, thin, watching. I started the engine, floored the gas, tore down the dirt road, tires skidding in the loose gravel. I didn't look back. I don't know what I saw. I don't want to know. I left everything behind. My tent, my gear, everything. I never went back. Never told anyone. But sometimes late at night, when the wind is still and the world goes quiet, I get that feeling again. Like something is watching, waiting. And I know, deep in my gut, the woods never let you go. I always thought I knew the woods. I grew up in them, spent more time among the trees than in town. They weren't a place to be afraid of, they were home. I knew how to read them, how to listen, how to move through them without a sound. I knew what to look for, what to avoid. I had been hunting since I was a kid, learning from my father, and later on my own. But knowing the woods doesn't mean they can't turn on you. And when they do, nothing can save you. It was late October when I set out, the best time of year for hunting. The leaves had mostly fallen, leaving the forest floor covered in red and brown, dry and brittle underfoot. The air had that sharp chill that let you know winter wasn't far off, but it wasn't cold enough yet to make the trip miserable. I had planned everything carefully. A week in the deep woods, far from the roads, away from the other hunters. I wanted to be alone. That was the whole point, to get away, to find some real quiet, to be out there with nothing but the trees and the animals. I loaded up my truck with everything I needed: rifle, food, extra layers, my tent, a good first aid kit, a GPS, a map, a compass. I wasn't stupid. I knew how dangerous the wilderness could be, how fast things could go wrong. I had prepared for everything, or at least I thought I had. The drive took most of the day. I followed the paved roads until they turned to gravel, then gravel until it was nothing but old logging trails, barely wide enough for my truck. I went as far as I could before the road ended, then parked, grabbed my pack, and started hiking. The land out there was wild, untouched. No trails, no signs of people, just thick trees and steep ridges. The kind of place that didn't want you there. The kind of place that didn't make anything easy. I hiked for hours, picking my way over rough ground, through dense underbrush, up and down hills that seemed to go on forever. I wanted to get far enough in that I wouldn't have to worry about anyone stumbling into my camp. By the time I found a good spot, the sun was already sinking behind the trees. A small clearing, not too open, but flat enough to set up my tent. A stream nearby for water. Plenty of dry wood for a fire. I set up camp, built a fire, ate, listened to the woods settle as the last light faded. The normal sounds of the forest at night, the rustling of small animals, the distant hoot of an owl, the whisper of the wind through the branches. Everything felt right. Everything felt normal. But I should have left then. The first sign that something was off came the next morning. I woke before sunrise, the way I always did when I was hunting. The fire had burned down to embers, the air cold, my breath fogging as I sat up, stretched, unzipped the tent. And that's when I saw them, tracks fresh, deep in the soft earth near the fire pit. Not boot prints, not animal tracks, bare feet, big, too big. I stared at them, my brain refusing to understand what I was seeing. They led from the trees to the fire, then back again. Someone had been here, while I was sleeping, watching. My stomach clenched. I scanned the woods, my rifle suddenly feeling too small, too useless. But there was nothing, just trees, just the early morning mist curling between them. I forced myself to breathe, to think. Maybe I had missed them when I set up camp. Maybe they weren't as fresh as they looked. I told myself that, and I forced myself to believe it. I had hiked too far to turn back now, so I shook it off, and I went hunting. The deeper I went into the woods, the quieter they got. At first, I didn't notice. I was focused, moving slow, careful, scanning for tracks, for any sign of deer. But after a while, I realized it.
No birds.
No rustling in the underbrush. Nothing. Just silence. A deep, heavy silence that sat between the trees like something alive. I had never heard the woods this quiet before. Not even in winter. It wasn't right. I kept going, but my grip on my rifle tightened. Every few steps, I stopped, listened, waited. Nothing. But I could feel it. Something watching. Not an animal. Not a deer. Something else. I turned back toward camp, moving faster than I meant to, my breath coming short, my muscles tense. The feeling didn't go away, and I knew, deep down, that I wasn't alone. The camp was untouched when I got back. The fire still smoldering, my gear right where I left it, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, rifle in my lap, staring at the tree line, listening, waiting, and at some point, maybe an hour before dawn, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the edge of the clearing. I gripped my rifle so hard my hands ached. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wanted to move, wanted to shine my flashlight, wanted to stand up, wanted to do something. But I didn't. I just sat there, frozen. And after a while, the footsteps stopped. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed up as fast as I could, shoving everything into my pack, barely stopping to eat. I just wanted to be gone. The hike back felt longer. The silence was worse. The feeling was worse. Every step, I expected to hear footsteps behind me. Every time the wind shifted, I thought I saw something move in the trees. I kept going, pushing through the ache in my legs, the weight of my pack digging into my shoulders. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't walking out of those woods alone. When I reached my truck, I almost collapsed with relief. I threw my pack into the bed, climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I backed up, turned around, started down the rough dirt road. And in the rearview mirror, just for a second, I saw something standing at the tree line. Tall, thin, watching. I didn't stop, didn't look again, just kept driving. I never went back to that part of the woods. I still hunt, still camp, but not alone, never alone. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world is quiet, I think about those tracks by my fire, and I wonder, if I had woken up just a little sooner, what would I have seen? I spent my life in the woods, grew up in them, worked in them, learned everything about them. I've hunted, camped, hiked, and worked forestry jobs all over the country. I know how to read the land, how to track, how to move through deep wilderness without getting lost. I've also seen how fast things can go wrong. It only takes one mistake, and if you're far enough out, one mistake is all it takes to kill you. I had been planning the trip for months. A solo hike, 5 days deep in the Adirondacks, mapping out an old logging area for a personal project. I wanted to see how much of the land had recovered. It was supposed to be a quiet trip. Just me, my pack, my GPS, and the woods. The kind of trip I lived for. I had everything I needed: a tent, food, water filtration, a satellite phone for emergencies, and my rifle. The area wasn't known for big predators, but I always carried one anyway, just in case. I checked the weather before heading out. Clear days ahead, cool nights, no storms. Perfect. I parked my truck on a service road, locked up, double-checked my gear, and started walking. The first day was easy. I followed an old logging road for a few miles, then cut into the woods, moving through a mix of thick pine and hardwoods. The ground was uneven, full of old stumps, fallen logs, and thick brush, but nothing I couldn't handle. By late afternoon, I found a good spot near a small stream, set up my tent, built a fire, and ate. The woods were quiet, just the way I liked them. I fell asleep to the sound of water trickling over rocks. The second day, I moved deeper. I covered miles of untouched forest, marking old trails on my GPS, taking notes on the land. Everything felt normal. But that evening, when I made camp, I had the first moment where something felt off. It was small, just a flicker of unease. The woods were too quiet.
No birds.
No rustling in the brush, just the wind in the trees and the stream nearby. I told myself it was nothing. I had spent plenty of nights alone in the woods, and sometimes things were just quiet. But I kept my rifle closer that night, and I woke up more than once, staring into the darkness, listening. By the third day, I was too deep to turn back easily. I had planned a loop, hiking into the valley, then cutting north and circling back toward my truck on a different route. That morning, I started noticing little things that made my skin crawl. The first was a set of footprints, not boot prints, bare feet, big. I crouched down, running my fingers through the dirt. The tracks weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Maybe a day or two. They were deep. Whatever had made them was heavy, and they went in a straight line through the trees, not meandering like a hunter or hiker, just straight, like something moving with purpose. I stared at them longer than I should have. Then I stood up, adjusted my pack, and kept moving. Around noon, I found something else. An old campsite, not old like from last year, old like abandoned. A fire pit, half collapsed, filled with ash and bits of charred bone. A tent, weathered, torn, half buried under leaves. And a backpack, faded, torn, zipper broken. I checked inside. Empty. No ID, no gear, no sign of who had left it. The tent was the same. No sleeping bag, no supplies, nothing. Like whoever had been here had walked away and never come back. I stood there for a long time, the woods pressing in around me, the silence too thick. I should have turned around then, but I didn't. I told myself it was old, that someone had left it behind years ago. I kept walking. That night, I built my fire high. The feeling hadn't gone away. If anything, it was worse. The woods felt wrong. And then, sometime after midnight, I heard it. Far off. A branch snapping. Then another. Slow. Heavy. Something moving through the trees. Not fast. Not like an animal. I gripped my rifle, my heart hammering. I stared into the dark, watching the firelight flicker against the trees, my breath shallow. The footsteps came closer, then stopped, just outside the fire's glow. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I sat there for hours, clutching my rifle, staring at the trees, waiting. At some point, the footsteps faded. I didn't sleep. At first light, I packed up and started moving fast. I wasn't finishing the loop. I was going back the way I came. The hike back felt different. The woods felt different. I kept catching glimpses of things through the trees. Shadows, movement, nothing clear. But I knew I wasn't alone. And then I found the second set of tracks. Right over mine from the day before. Big.
Bore.
Deep. Following me. I moved faster. Didn't stop to eat. Didn't stop for water. Just walked. Hours passed. My legs burned. My pack dug into my shoulders, My breath came hard. I wasn't thinking about anything except getting back to my truck. And then I saw it. Ahead, right in the middle of the trail. A fresh fire pit. Still warm. Something had been there. Waiting. Watching. And I knew right then that I had been walking in circles. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the weight of my pack. Didn't care about the branches tearing at my clothes. I ran, gasping for breath, my boots slamming against the dirt. I wasn't thinking anymore, just moving, just trying to get away. I ran until my legs gave out, until I collapsed against a tree, choking on air, sweat pouring down my back. And when I looked up, there it was, my truck, right where I left it. I had made it. I stumbled forward, yanked the door open, threw myself inside. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I floored the gas, spinning gravel, tearing down the road. I didn't look back, didn't stop, didn't breathe until I hit pavement. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't know who or what was following me. But I know this. I've been in the woods my whole life, and I've never gone back to that place. And I never will. I've spent most of my life in the woods. Grew up in them, worked in them, learned how to live in them. I've always been comfortable being alone out there. Some people don't understand it. They say the woods feel too empty, too quiet. But to me, they've always felt like home. I thought I knew everything about them. I thought I knew how to read them. But last fall, I learned how fast the woods can turn against you, and how easy it is to disappear. It was late October when I set out, the best time of year for hunting. The leaves had already started falling, leaving the forest floor covered in red and brown. The air was cold enough to see your breath in the mornings, but not bitter yet. I had planned everything carefully. A 5-day trip into a remote part of the Appalachians, deep enough that I wouldn't run into anyone else. I wanted to be alone. I loaded up my truck with everything I needed: rifle, food, tent, extra layers, GPS, compass, map. I wasn't an idiot. I knew how dangerous the wilderness could be, how fast things could go wrong. I had prepared for everything, or at least I thought I had. The drive took half the day. I followed paved roads until they turned to gravel, then gravel until they became nothing but old logging trails. I went as far as I could before the road ended, parked, grabbed my pack, and started hiking. The land out there was rugged, untouched. No trails, no signs of people. Just thick trees and steep ridges. The kind of place that didn't make anything easy. I hiked for hours, pushing through dense underbrush, climbing over fallen logs, moving deeper into the mountains. By late afternoon, I found a good spot near a stream, set up my tent, built a fire, ate. The woods were quiet, peaceful. Everything felt right. Everything felt normal. I should have left then. The first sign that something was off came the next morning. I woke up just before sunrise, the way I always do when I'm camping. The fire had burned down to embers. The air was cold. I stretched, unzipped the tent, and froze. There were tracks in the dirt. Not animal tracks, not boot prints, bare feet, big, deep. They led from the trees to the fire pit, then back into the woods. I stared at them for a long time, my brain refusing to accept what I was seeing. Someone had been here, while I was sleeping, watching. My stomach clenched. I scanned the woods, my rifle suddenly feeling too small, too useless. But there was nothing, just trees, just the early morning mist curling between them. I forced myself to breathe, to think. Maybe I had missed them when I set up camp. Maybe they weren't as fresh as they looked. I told myself that, and I forced myself to believe it. I had hiked too far to turn back now, so I shook it off, and I went hunting. The deeper I went, the quieter the woods became. At first, I didn't notice. I was focused, moving slow, careful, scanning for tracks, for any sign of deer. But after a while, I realized it.
no birds.
No rustling in the underbrush. Nothing. Just silence. A deep, heavy silence that pressed against my ears, that made my skin crawl. I had never heard the woods this quiet before, not even in winter. It wasn't right. I kept going, my grip on my rifle tightening. Every few steps, I stopped, listened, waited. Nothing. But I could feel it. Something was out there, watching. I turned back toward camp, moving faster than I meant to, my breath coming short, my muscles tense. The feeling didn't go away, and I knew, deep down, that I wasn't alone. The camp was untouched when I got back. The fire still smoldering, my gear right where I left it, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, rifle in my lap, staring at the tree line, listening, waiting, and at some point, maybe an hour before dawn, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the edge of the clearing. I gripped my rifle so hard my hands ached. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wanted to move, wanted to shine my flashlight, wanted to stand up, wanted to do something. But I didn't. I just sat there, frozen. And after a while, the footsteps stopped. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed up as fast as I could, shoving everything into my pack, barely stopping to eat. I just wanted to be gone. The hike back felt longer. The silence was worse. The feeling was worse. Every step, I expected to hear footsteps behind me. Every time the wind shifted, I thought I saw something move in the trees. I kept going, pushing through the ache in my legs, the weight of my pack digging into my shoulders. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't walking out of those woods alone. And then, sometime in the afternoon, I saw something ahead of me. At first, I thought it was my truck. But as I got closer, my stomach dropped. It wasn't my truck. It was a cabin. Old, rotting. I hadn't passed it on the way in. I was sure of that. But there it was, standing in the middle of a clearing. The door was open. I don't know why, but I stepped closer. And inside, a fire pit, still warm. And next to it, my footprints. From yesterday, I had been there before. I had walked in circles. Something had led me there. I turned and ran. I don't remember much of the hike after that. Just moving. Just running. Somehow I made it back to my truck. Somehow I got in, started the engine, drove. I didn't stop. Didn't breathe until I saw the first signs of town. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't know who or what was following me. But I know this. I've been in the woods my whole life, and I've never gone back to that place. And I never will. I have spent most of my life in the woods. I was raised on the edge of the mountains, grew up hunting, camping, and fishing. I have worked forestry jobs, survival training, and spent more nights alone in the wilderness than I can count. I have seen the way nature can turn on you. A single mistake, a wrong turn, a misjudged step. Sometimes that's all it takes to go from safe to lost. Last fall, I learned just how fast it can happen, and just how far something can follow you. It started as a routine trip. 5 days alone in a remote part of the Pacific Northwest, a place I had mapped out months before. It was deep enough into the mountains that I knew I wouldn't see another person. That was the goal. I packed light but smart rifle gear, food, a GPS, a paper map just in case, a satellite phone for emergencies. I wasn't reckless. I had done this plenty of times before. I checked the weather before leaving. Cold at night, mild during the day, no storms. I parked my truck at a logging road, locked it up, shouldered my pack, and started walking. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. I moved deep into the valley, following an old game trail. The land was untouched, thick with pine and ferns, the ground damp and soft beneath my boots. I saw signs of elk, deer, even a black bear in the distance, but nothing unusual. By the second night, I was nearly at the spot I had marked as my turnaround point. That was the first time I felt it. It's hard to describe. A feeling, more than anything, like the woods had shifted somehow, like I was being watched. I have camped alone in the wilderness for years. I know the difference between the natural unease of being alone in the dark and something else. This was something else. The woods were too quiet. No wind, no insects, no movement, just stillness. I sat by my fire for a long time, staring into the trees, my rifle within reach. Nothing happened. I eventually convinced myself I was imagining it. But I didn't sleep well that night. The third morning, I started heading back. That was when I saw the first tracks. They weren't boot prints, and they weren't from an animal. Bare feet, big, deep. They followed my trail. Not in a straight line, not alongside it, over it, like something had been following me. I crouched down, running my fingers over the indentations in the soft earth. They were fresh, maybe a few hours old. I scanned the trees. Nothing. I gripped my rifle tighter and kept walking. I moved faster that day. The feeling hadn't gone away. Every few minutes, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, checking the trail behind me. The woods felt different, like something had settled over them, a heaviness. And then, in the late afternoon, I found something that stopped me cold. A fire pit, still warm. Someone had been here. Recently, I checked the ground. More footprints, big, bare, deep, and beside them mine. From yesterday, someone had been walking the same trail as me. Right behind me. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that fire. I don't know what I was waiting for, but I felt it then, stronger than before. Something was out there, watching, waiting. I turned and walked, faster. By nightfall, I had put miles between myself and that fire pit. I found a new place to camp, higher up, away from the valley floor. A good spot, clear sight lines, defensible. I built my fire high, ate fast, kept my rifle in my lap. The woods were silent again, but this time I knew it wasn't natural. And sometime after midnight I heard it. Footsteps, not a deer, not an elk, not anything on four legs. Two, slow, heavy, moving through the trees, circling. I sat still, gripping my rifle, staring into the dark. The fire crackled, casting long shadows against the trunks. The footsteps stopped. I stayed awake until dawn. I never heard them start again. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed up, barely stopping to eat, moving fast. The feeling hadn't gone away. If anything, it was worse. Every few minutes, I stopped, listened, checked my back trail. Nothing. But I knew, somehow, that I wasn't alone. And then, around noon, I saw it. Ahead of me, on the trail, a fresh fire pit, still warm, and beside it a piece of my gear, one of my gloves. I hadn't dropped it. Someone had taken it, and left it for me to find. I turned and ran. I don't remember most of the hike after that. Just moving. Fast. Not stopping, not looking back. I hit the logging road in the late afternoon, my truck sitting right where I left it. The relief was so strong I almost collapsed. I got in, locked the doors, started the engine. I was halfway down the road when I saw it. In my rearview mirror, a figure, tall, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. I didn't slow down, didn't look again, just drove. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't know how long they had been following me. But I know this, I have never gone back, and I never will.